Max remained planted by the dresser, occasionally glancing back at Greg like he was urging him to do something. The dog wasn't wrong often, and this wasn't the kind of behavior he'd show over something casual like a forgotten snack. His posture, his stillness, and that low, vibrating growl meant one thing: Max had detected something out of place, something serious. Helen stood a few feet away, her fingers trembling round the edge of her blanket shawl. She didn't sit down, didn't move, just kept staring at the drawer like it had come back to haunt her. Greg glanced around the room. Everything was neat, almost too neat. The bed was made with military precision. The curtains were drawn just right, the rug aligned perfectly with the wall trim, but the dresser stood out, not because it was messy, but because it felt untouched, like something sacred or dangerous was locked inside. "Do you remember what's in the drawer, ma'am?" Greg asked again, softer now. Helen's voice was barely a whisper. "Things I didn't want to see anymore." Greg studied her face. She didn't seem scared of him, but whatever memories that drawer held, they had aged her in ways time alone never could. "I don't want to pry," he said, keeping his tone calm. "But Max's training tells me there's more to this than dust or clothing. Would you mind if we had maintenance come check it later, just for safety?" Helen nodded slowly, but didn't say a word. Her eyes stayed on Max, who hadn't moved an inch. Nurse Karen stepped in, glancing between the tense room and Greg. "Officer, if it's something you think we should investigate, we can have our evening staff bring a locksmith. Miss Marston has never let anyone look in that drawer." Greg gave a polite nod, then crouched next to Max and gently placed a hand on his back. "Good boy," he murmured. Max finally broke his stare to look at Greg, then licked his hand once and relaxed us slightly. "I'll file a note with your supervisor." Greg told Karen, "I want to check in tomorrow, just to follow up." As they left the room, Max turned one last time and let out a small whine. Helen met his gaze, and for a second, something shifted in her expression. Grief, fear, maybe even guilt, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Back in the patrol vehicle, Greg sat behind the wheel, tapping the steering wheel lightly while Max rested in the passenger seat. The afternoon sun had started to dip, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Greg couldn't shake it. Max didn't overreact. That drawer was more than a scent marker. His gut told him they'd just cracked open the edge of something that had been buried, maybe literally for years. He pulled out his notebook and scribbled down what he remembered. Room 27, Helen Marston, locked drawer. Max signaled hard scent or trauma. Helen's reaction, quiet but unsettled. Drawer contents, unknown claims. She lost the key years ago. He underlined the last part twice. Then, looking at Max, who had now dozed off slightly, but with one eye still open, he said aloud, "What? Did you smell in there, boy?" Max didn't answer. Of course. But that lingering tension hadn't left Greg's chest. In his years with the K9 unit, he'd learned to trust the dog's instincts more than even his own. And right now, those instincts were telling him one thing: this wasn't over. The next morning, Greg Daniels arrived at Rosewood Nursing Home, earlier than usual. He didn't wear his uniform this time, just jeans and a grey jacket. Max trotted beside him, calm but alert. The previous day's incident hadn't left Greg's mind. Max's intensity in Helen Marston's room was unlike anything he'd seen during a community visit. It didn't make sense, and yet it did. Sometimes instinct saw what the eyes couldn't. Single quotes. Did Nurse Karen greeted him near the front desk. "You're back early," she said, half smiling. "Couldn't stop thinking about yesterday," Greg admitted. "Did maintenance check the drawer?" She hesitated. "We tried, but Miss Marston changed her mind this morning. Said she didn't want anyone touching it. She locked the room." Greg's brows furrowed. "Is that normal behavior for her?" Karen lowered her voice and leaned in slightly. "Miss Marston's different, keeps to herself. She's been here almost 11 years, barely leaves her room. The staff say she used to be sociable when she first arrived, but something changed around 2013. One day, she just shut down, started avoiding people, wouldn't talk about her family, and no one pressed her." Greg's interest peaked. "Any family on file?" Karen shook her head. "Not really. No visitors in years. No emergency contact. Just the name of a Marston, but it's marked as out of contact." He repeated the name to himself. "Emily. What happened in 2013? He asked. Karen hesitated again. "She moved in that year. That's all we know. Her records before that are sparse. It's like she came here to forget something. Greg looked down at Max, who sat quietly but was watching the east hallway. Can I speak with her? He asked. She's in her room, Karen said, but I'm not sure she'll talk. Greg thanked her and made his way down the corridor. Room 27 looked the same quiet. Still, the curtains drawn like the day before. He knocked gently. No answer. He waited, then knocked again. Miss Marston, it's Greg Daniels from yesterday. I brought Max. Still no sound. Just as he was about to turn away, the door creaked open a few inches. Helen stood behind it, eyes sunken, wrapped in a faded sweater. I told them no, she said, her voice thin. I know, Greg replied, keeping his voice soft. I'm not here to force anything, but Max is trained to detect trauma, chemical traces, hidden materials, even human remains. Something flickered in her expression, fear perhaps, or a memory. She stepped back wordlessly and let the door swing open. The room looked exactly as it had, the bed still made with precision, the same rug, the same air of stillness. Max moved cautiously, sniffing around again, but he didn't bark this time. Instead, he returned to the dresser, nose pressed to the bottom drawer. Greg sat in the nearby chair. What's in that drawer? Helen. She lowered herself into her armchair, hands folded in her lap. A letter, she said quietly. A box. Some things I couldn't throw away. Why keep it locked? I was afraid of what it might say, or what it might confirm. Greg waited, not pushing. It was my daughter's, Helen said finally. Emily. He stayed silent. She disappeared in 2013, just before I came here. One day, she was gone. The police said there wasn't enough evidence of foul play, said she might have run away. But I knew my daughter. She would have never just left. Greg felt a cold tingle run through him. She had a friend, Helen continued, an older man. He worked around the neighborhood, said he helped with house repairs. I never trusted him, always had a strange way of watching her. But Emily was 19. She thought she knew better. Do you remember his name? Greg asked gently. She shook her head. Only Donnie. That's all I ever heard. Did she leave a note? Anything? I found one. Helen whispered. It's in that drawer. I couldn't bring myself to read it. I was too afraid it would say goodbye, or worse. Max let out a small whine again, curling up near the dresser. Greg looked from the dog to the locked drawer. Whatever had happened to Emily Marston wasn't just memory. Max was responding to something real. Miss Marston, he said softly, would you be willing to let me read the letter? It might help. Helen didn't answer right away, but then she stood slowly and reached into her sweater pocket. She pulled out a small, rusted key. Her fingers trembled as she extended it toward him. Whatever's in there, she said, I think it's time I finally knew. Greg took the small, rusted key from Helen with both caution and care. He could feel how much weight the object carried for her, not just in its metal, but in memories. Max sat silently beside the dresser, still and observant, his ears slightly perked, as if he knew the moment was important. Helen didn't speak. She returned to her chair and clasped her hands tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the drawer like it was a ghost from her past about to speak again. Greg knelt in front of the dresser and slid the key into the lock. It clicked with a reluctant twist, stiff from years of disuse. The drawer creaked as he pulled it open slowly. Inside was a small, dust-covered wooden box. Beneath it lay a folded, quilted cloth, and beside that, a faded photograph stuck between the drawer lining and the back panel. He took the photo out gently. It showed a young girl, probably 18 or 19, standing barefoot in a grassy backyard, smiling with her hands raised toward the camera. The back read, Emily, summer 12. Greg placed the photo on the table and turned his attention to the box. He opened it carefully. Inside were a few items: a tiny stuffed lion with a missing button eye, a silver locket, tarnished and cold, a dried rose wrapped in tissue, and a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, labeled in cursive, to be, read if I ever go missing. Greg looked at Helen, who was staring straight at the box now, her eyes misting but her mouth set in a thin line. I never read it, she whispered. I couldn't. I was too afraid of what it might say. I thought maybe not knowing would hurt less. Greg understood. Some truths cut deeper than the unknown. But now, after 10 years, maybe this letter was the only chance to find out what really happened. Would it be all right if I read it? He asked gently. Helen hesitated, then gave a faint nod. Yes. Greg unfolded the letter slowly. The ink was faded, but the words remained clear. Dear Mum, if you're reading this, something's gone wrong. I hope I'm safe somewhere, and this was all a dumb overreaction. But if I'm not, then you were right. That's about Donnie. He's not who he says he is. I caught him going through my things last week. At first I thought it was just weird, but then I found that he'd been hiding a key in the shed. I don't know to what, but something about it gave me a terrible feeling. He'd been pressuring me to leave town with him. Keep saying he can help me start fresh. I told him, no, but he said people won't find me if I change my mind. He made it sound like a joke. I don't think it was. If I disappear, it's Donnie. Please don't let them say I ran away. Please don't stop looking. Love you. Always. Emily. Greg stared at the last line for a moment, the final loop of her signature trembling on the page. He set the letter down slowly. His throat felt tight. Helen had stopped holding back her tears. Silent streams ran down her cheeks. I knew it, she whispered. I knew he wasn't right, but no one listened. Not even Emily. Not at first. Greg cleared his throat. Did the police ever question him? Back when she vanished. She shook her head. They barely looked. Said there was no sign of struggle. No clear evidence. Just a girl old enough to leave on her own if she wanted. Greg rose from the floor and looked down at Max, who was still seated but watching Helen carefully. I'm reopening this, he said quietly. This letter. This changes everything. If Donnie was real, I'll find him. He's out there. Helen didn't speak, but in her eyes, Greg saw the smallest glint of something returning hope. Perhaps, or maybe just the beginning of it. Back at the station later that day, Greg handed the letter and Emily's belongings to Detective Mia Riley, who had taken over cold case reviews recently. She read the letter silently, her brow creased in concentration. This could be enough to reclassify her case as a suspected abduction, she said. We'll need to dig into Rosewood's staff records nearby, maintenance contracts, anything from that year. You said his name was Donnie. That's all Helen remembers. Just Donnie. Worked in the area, maybe unofficially. Riley nodded. We'll start there. And if Max's instincts were right the first time, maybe he's right about where this trail leads. Greg glanced at Max, who sat patiently outside the door. He's never wrong, Greg said. Not when it matters. That night, Helen Marston didn't sleep. She sat in her chair, staring at the spot where the drawer had once been locked, shut sealed with the weight of silence and fear, for more than a decade. Now, the secret was out. Her trembling hands still felt the cold metal of the key, and her ears rang with the words Emily had written. If I disappear, it's Donnie. It played over and over in her head. The girl she raised with lullabies and school lunches had tried to protect herself the best she could, but no one had believed her, not even Helen. Not completely. By morning, Helen had grown pale and unsteady. Nurse Karen found her trying to dress herself with shaking fingers. Miss Marston, she said gently, why don't you rest a little? I can help with anything you need. I need to talk to that officer, Helen whispered. Please, Greg, I need to tell him everything. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Greg and Detective Riley had begun combing through archived employment records and background checks from 2012 to 2013. It wasn't easy. If Donnie had worked off the books, there wouldn't be a paper trail. Still, Riley found something, an old maintenance work order, tied to a man named Donald Cresswell. It wasn't much, but it listed minor home repairs completed at Helen Marston's previous address just 2 months before Emily disappeared. Riley spun her monitor toward Greg. Donald Cresswell, 48 years old back then. No criminal history, but look, he left the state right after Emily vanished. No forwarding address. Greg felt his pulse rise. Can you get me his photo? She clicked a few keys and pulled up a grainy DMV photo from 2012. Grey cap, sullen eyes, crooked teeth. Greg stared at the face for a long moment. I need to show this to Helen. Back at Rosewood, Helen was waiting in the recreation room with Max curled quietly at her feet. The dog had insisted on staying beside her the moment Greg arrived. It was like he could sense she was finally ready to unload a weight she had carried for far too long. Greg pulled up a chair. We may have found him. Helen, take your time, but I need you to look at this photo. He held the printout gently in front of her. Helen's hands hovered for a second, then slowly took the paper. The moment her eyes met the face in the photo, her body jerked. That's him, she whispered. That's Donnie. You're sure? I'd never forget those teeth. He used to smile like he was enjoying a joke no one else got. I didn't like him from the start, but he was always polite to Emily, offered to fix our gate, then the water heater. Then he started showing up unannounced. Greg leaned forward. Did you ever see them together? I caught them once. He was in the backyard, showing her how to fix something. She laughed with him. It looked harmless, but I saw how he looked at her when she turned away. Helen's voice cracked. I told her he was dangerous. I begged her to stop talking to him. We argued. I didn't even hug her that night. And then, she was gone. She covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook. For the first time since this all began, Helen broke down, sobbing, finally unburdening the grief she'd buried so deep. It had twisted her life into silence. Greg said nothing. He let the moment breathe. Max nudged closer to her chair, resting his head gently against her leg. She was just a kid, Helen said through tears. She wanted to see the good in people, and I failed her. No, Greg said firmly. You didn't fail her. You gave us the truth. You held on to the only piece of evidence that could bring her justice. Helen looked up. Her eyes were red, but clearer. I want you to find him, she said. Whatever it takes. Greg stood. We will. Later that evening, Riley found more. Donald Cresswell had changed addresses multiple times, trailer parks, temporary jobs, no stable record. But one thing stood out. In 2014, he lived on the outskirts of a rural town, in a small house owned by a deceased relative. Get this, Riley said. That property was condemned 2 years ago, vacant, but it's still standing, barely. Greg's eyes narrowed. Let's take Max. As they packed the car, Max hopped into the back seat without needing a command. He was ready. Greg looked at Riley. If Emily's trail ends there, Max will know. And in his gut, Greg felt it. After 10 long years, the truth was no longer buried. It was about to be unearthed. The abandoned house sat at the edge of an overgrown lot, shrouded by leaning pine trees and long grass that reached the ankles. Its chipped paint curled off the wood like dead skin, and the rusted front gate hung open, creaking with every gust of wind. The place hadn't just been empty, it had been forgotten. Greg Daniels and Detective Mia Riley stepped out of the cruiser, boots crunching on gravel. Max leaped down beside them, ears alert, nose twitching in the damp morning air. The house once belonged to Donald Cresswell's uncle. After the man's death, Donald had moved in for a year, then vanished again. Now, the structure stood like a secret waiting to be told. No power, no plumbing, Riley said, glancing at the condemned sign tacked to the doorframe. Neighbors reported strange smells once, but no follow-up. Greg glanced down at Max. Let's see what you find, boy. They entered carefully. The inside was even worse, floorboards warped from years of moisture. Mold crept up the corners of the walls, and the entire place smelled of rot and rust. Old newspapers were scattered across the floor, like breadcrumbs from a decade ago. Max began moving methodically, sniffing from room to room, pausing in doorways, circling slowly. Greg stayed close, watching his body language. Riley moved behind them, flashlights sweeping across every dusty shelf and cabinet. It wasn't until Max entered the back hallway that his behavior changed. He stopped. Then, his tail stiffened. His nose went to the floorboards, and he growled. Here, Greg said quietly, but Max pressed against the base of a rotting door that led to the crawl space under the house. He scratched twice hard, then sat. His signature. Something's under there, Greg said. Riley opened the small hatch with effort. The rusted latch broke clean off in her hand. The musty air that escaped was thick and cold. Greg crouched and shone his flashlight inside. It was narrow, barely 3 feet high. The dirt floor littered with broken beams and scattered debris. Max ducked in first, crawling low. Greg followed, holding the light steady as dust stirred around them. After only 10 feet, Max stopped and began pawing at a mound of disturbed soil beneath a broken wooden board. Greg's heart pounded. This is it. He reached for his radio. This is Officer Daniels. I need forensics and a recovery team at the location. Possible buried remains. Site secure. The crime scene unit arrived within the hour. They excavated slowly, with care, and as Greg feared, what they uncovered was no mere animal bones or trash. It was a satchel. Inside was a necklace with a cracked, heart-shaped pendant, matching the one in the wooden box from Helen's drawer. Tucked within the satchel was a second envelope. This one, weathered and sealed in plastic. The writing had faded, but 2 words were still legible. For Mom. Greg stepped back, unable to breathe for a moment. Riley placed a hand on his shoulder. By dusk, a coroner had confirmed the remains found nearby were female, roughly 19 years old at time of death. DNA testing would take days, but no one doubted who it was. Emily Marsden had never run away. She had been buried here, under dirt and silence, for more than a decade. Back at the nursing home, Greg sat across from Helen once more. Her eyes were glassy, her face pale, but she sat straighter than he'd seen her before. "I promised I'd find out what happened," Greg said softly. "We did." He handed her the locket. Her fingers curled around it like it was life itself. "She didn't leave you," he said. "She fought. She left the letter. She tried to warn you." Helen opened the locket slowly. Inside was a photo of Emily at age 5. On the other side, scrawled in tiny print, were the words "Still with you." For a long time, Helen said nothing. Then, with a trembling voice, she whispered, "Thank you. You and that brave dog of yours. You gave me my daughter back." Greg looked down at Max, who rested at Helen's feet again, calm and still. "She never stopped calling out," Helen said, and somehow, he heard her. The news broke like a storm. Local papers called it the forgotten case that barked back. Television crews camped outside the Rosewood nursing home, but none of the noise reached Helen Marston's room. She stayed inside, quiet and grieving, fingers constantly turning over the locket that once belonged to her daughter. Meanwhile, Greg Daniels and Detective Riley had their eyes fixed on one man, Donald Cresswell. The tip from New Hampshire authorities had paid off. A man going by Don Cray had been working maintenance at a rural elder care facility for the last 3 years. Quiet, hard-working, never missed a shift. No criminal history, no family. When police showed up at his rented trailer, he was already gone. "He ran," Riley said, pacing the hallway of the precinct. "Left everything behind, even his wallet. Means he knows it's all catching up," Greg muttered, "which also means he's desperate." They put out an APB and flagged every nearby bus terminal and highway. The last signal from his burner phone had pinged a cell tower near the state border. No activity since, but Greg had a feeling he hadn't gone far. That night, Greg sat on his couch, rubbing Max's back as the dog rested his head in his lap. His mind raced through everything: the drawer, the letter, the satchel buried in that crawl space. If Max hadn't reacted in Helen's room, none of it would have come to light. Emily's story would have remained buried with her. His phone buzzed. It was Riley. "You're going to want to hear this," she said. "I just got a call from the New Hampshire troopers. Cresswell didn't go far. He used an old ID to check into a cheap motel 20 miles out. Manager recognized him from our photo. We have a team on him. They're watching, but waiting on us. You and Max, ready?" Greg was already standing. By dawn, they arrived at the motel low end. 2 stories, sagging walls. Room 12 had the curtains drawn. No signs of activity. Max stepped out of the cruiser calmly, but with sharp eyes. He sniffed the air, nose twitching as the breeze shifted. "Let's walk the perimeter," Greg said, as they approached the back alley. Max tensed. He stopped near a stack of discarded pallets and sniffed the concrete beneath. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Greg froze. "He's been here." Suddenly, the motel door creaked open on the far side. A man in a faded hoodie and dark jeans slipped out, trying to stay low. His hood was up, face turned away. But Greg recognized the gait, the same figure from that old photograph of Donald Cresswell. "Freeze!" Riley shouted. The man bolted. Greg didn't even need to give the order. Max lunged forward, leash tight in Greg's hand as they gave chase. Through the narrow alley, across a gravel lot, Max never let up. The man turned into a dead end near a storage shed. He looked back, panicked, back, growled louder, teeth bared. "Don't move." Greg barked, gun drawn. "Lie flat on the ground." The man hesitated. Max took 1 step forward. That was enough. Donald Cresswell dropped to his knees, hands in the air. Back at the station, Cresswell was booked on suspicion of murder, evidence tampering, and obstruction. The DNA results from the remains came back the next day. Confirmed match for Emily Marston. But the most chilling part wasn't what was found, it was what Donald eventually admitted. "She wanted to leave," he told Riley during interrogation. "Told me she changed her mind. I panicked. She was going to tell her mother everything. I didn't mean to hurt her. I just didn't want to lose her." "You buried her like garbage," Riley spat. "You let her mother suffer for 10 years. Donald said nothing else. That evening, Greg returned to Rosewood. Helen was sitting near the window, her eyes watching the sky. "He's in custody," Greg said. He confessed. Helen didn't speak right away. Then she gave a single, slow nod. Max walked to her side and gently placed his head in her lap. She smiled for the first time in days. "You found her," she said softly. "You never even knew her, but you found her." Greg stood by the door, watching the old woman stroke the dog's fur. Max had done more than find a body. He had unearthed a truth no one else believed. The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the back row, their pens scratching paper every time the name Donald Cresswell was mentioned. Police officers stood at the walls, arms folded, watching the man who had evaded justice for over a decade. But front and center, wearing a pale blue cardigan and sitting perfectly still, was Helen Marston. Next to her, Greg sat quietly, and at her feet, Max lay like a statue, his presence unspoken, but deeply felt. Donald had pleaded not guilty, but the evidence against him was staggering. Emily's remains, buried on his former property, her letter warning of his behavior, his confession, recorded on tape, the necklace in the satchel, the motel escape attempt. But the most damning piece had come in just 2 days before the official DNA match, proving without question that the body found under that crawlspace belonged to Emily Marston. Greg still remembered the moment he broke the news to Helen. She hadn't cried, she hadn't gasped, she had simply closed her eyes, placed her hand over her heart, and said, "I already knew. Max told me before the test ever could." Now, in the courtroom, she sat in quiet dignity as the prosecutor laid out the timeline of events: Emily's disappearance, the years Helen spent in silence, the drawer left untouched for a decade, and finally, the K9 unit's unexpected visit that cracked it all open. Every word felt heavier than the last dot. When it was Helen's turn to testify, she stood slowly. The bailiff helped her to the stand. The room fell completely still. She spoke, softly, her voice thin but unwavering. "My daughter didn't run away," she said. "She wasn't reckless, she wasn't impulsive. She trusted the wrong man, and the people who were supposed to protect her didn't believe me when I said something was wrong." Her eyes moved toward Donald, who sat with his head lowered, avoiding her gaze. "She left me a letter I was too afraid to read. I lived 10 years with that weight in my chest, convinced it was my fault, that maybe she had walked out of my life by choice. But she didn't." Helen paused, her voice trembling slightly. She was buried by someone who thought no one would notice. But he didn't count on a dog named Max who noticed everything. Max perked his ears as if he recognized his name. Helen smiled. Faintly, he sniffed out the truth no one else saw. "He found my daughter's voice when mine had long been silenced." After her testimony, the courtroom was quiet again. Helen was helped back to her seat, and Max returned to her side like a guardian angel in fur. Greg leaned over and whispered, "You did good." She smiled. "No, he did good." Donald Cresswell was denied bail. The trial would continue, but the outcome felt certain. The evidence was overwhelming, and for the first time in 11 years, Helen felt something she hadn't dared to let herself feel. Relief. Not because it made the pain go away, not because it brought Emily back, but because Emily's story would no longer be lost under dust. Silence and disbelief. In the days that followed, the community rallied around Helen. Flowers arrived at her door. Letters poured in from people she'd never meet: her third parents, other victims, other silent survivors. Her story touched more than just her corner of the world. It echoed. Greg was asked to speak at a local event about the K9 unit's role in cold cases. He brought Max along, of course. But when he introduced the dog, he did something unexpected. He stepped aside and motioned toward the woman sitting in the front row. This case wasn't just solved because of one good dog, Greg said. It was solved because one woman never stopped carrying the truth inside her. Even when the world stopped listening, Helen stood slowly. The audience clapped, but she didn't wave. She simply bent down and placed a gentle kiss on Max's head. "He listened," she said softly. When no one else did, he listened. Outside, after the event, Helen walked alongside Greg and Max beneath the late afternoon sun. "You know," she said, "if Max ever decides to retire, I'd like to have him come visit more often." Greg smiled. "He's already made that decision." Max wagged his tail as if confirming it, and in that moment, it felt like something had shifted, not an ending. Not quite a new beginning, but a closing of one long, aching chapter. 6 months passed. The leaves turned golden and brittle. The trial ended. Donald Cresswell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom had been silent when the verdict was read. Helen Marston didn't cry. She simply sat still, hands folded over the locket around her neck. Her lips moved softly, as if she was speaking only to her daughter. Outside the courthouse, a few reporters approached her, microphones extended. She didn't speak to them, but Max did. He barked once, loud and sharp, then turned away, guiding her gently toward the waiting patrol car. The world could ask its questions another time. That moment belonged to silence and to peace. Back at the nursing home, Helen changed. She started leaving her room more often. She began attending the Wednesday afternoon tea socials she once ignored. She even asked the staff to plant a rosebush in the courtyard. A small plaque was placed at its base. It read simply, "In memory of Emily, still with you." She never explained the words to anyone, but when Greg visited with Max, she always invited them out to the courtyard first, to sit near the rosebush. Max would lay under the bench and rest his chin on her shoes, eyes closed, calm and still. Those visits became a tradition. Every Sunday morning, Greg and Max would walk through the front door of Rosewood. The receptionist barely looked up anymore. She'd just smile and waved him in. Residents came to expect it. Some called Max the angel dog. Others simply nodded when they passed. But everyone's staff and residents alike knew what he had done. He wasn't just a dog anymore. He was the reason truth came home. One particular Sunday, Greg walked into room 27 alone. Max wasn't at his side. His steps were slower now, older. The years were finally catching up. So Greg had let him stay in the car, resting with the window cracked open and the cool breeze brushing through his fur. Helen smiled when she saw Greg, but there was something different in her eyes. "I think it's time," she said softly. Greg pulled the chair closer. "Time for what?" She looked out the window, where the wind rustled through the courtyard trees. "For me to go home." Greg's expression softened. "You mean?" She nodded. "I've made peace. I've written a statement for the center about end-of-life care. I've spoken to the chaplain. I've made arrangements." Greg looked down. Helen reached for his hand and held it with surprising strength. "Don't be sad. I stayed in this world long enough to bring Emily back into it. That was all I was waiting for." A long pause passed. "I thought you'd want to say goodbye," she added gently. Greg swallowed the lump in his throat. "Would you like me to bring Max in?" Helen smiled. "If he's up for it." Minutes later, Max padded softly into the room. His movements were slower now, but his eyes were just as warm. When he saw Helen, he went straight to her without command. He rested his head gently in her lap, tail thumping once. Helen stroked his ears. "You good boy," she whispered. "You never gave up, did you?" Max blinked slowly, then closed his eyes. Greg stood silently in the corner, watching as time seemed to freeze between them. In that room, there were no questions left, no regrets, just a quiet, powerful love between a woman, her daughter's memory, and the dog who had brought the truth into daylight. Helen Marston passed peacefully 3 nights later, in her sleep. A letter was found beside her bed. It was addressed to Greg. It read, "To the man who listened, and to the dog who never looked away, thank you. You gave me something no one else ever could. Closure. You brought my daughter home. Please take care of Max. He was never just a dog. He was my final light." Greg folded the letter carefully and placed it in a small envelope. He didn't say much to anyone about what it meant, but he kept it locked in his desk, beside Max's service badge. 2 weeks later, the department officially retired Max. He had served for nearly 10 years. Greg took him home for good. They still walked by Rosewood sometimes. Max would stop near the courtyard fence and look at the spot where the rosebush bloomed. Even in the cold, Greg would crouch beside him and whisper, "She's with her now. Boy, you made sure of that." Max would wag his tail once, then sit still, as if standing guard over something no one else could see.